In 1964, Japan launched the Shinkansen. In 1981, France unveiled the TGV. By 1992, Spain was connecting cities at 300 kilometers per hour. Canada, a G7 nation with one of the densest corridors on the continent, today moves passengers between Toronto and Montreal slower than it did in the 1970s. Study after study found high-speed rail viable. Everyone was shelved. The question was never whether Canada could build it. In the decades after World War II, countries facing crowded roads and packed airways began searching for a faster way to connect their cities. Japan took the first leap. On October 1, 1964, the Shinkansen, known as the bullet train, began carrying passengers between Tokyo and Osaka at speeds of 210 kilometers per hour. The 4-hour journey cut travel time by nearly a third, and the sleek blue and white train became a symbol of modern Japan. Within years, the Shinkansen was running even faster, eventually reaching 285 kilometers per hour and setting a global benchmark for what rail could do. 17 years later, France followed. On September 22, 1981, the TGV Sud-Est hurtled out of Paris towards Lyon at 260 kilometers per hour. The trip, once nearly 4 hours, now took just 2.5 hours. By the end of the decade, French trains were running at 300 kilometers per hour, and the TGV brand stood for speed, comfort, and national pride. The French government made high-speed rail a public priority, building dedicated tracks and giving passenger trains absolute right-of-way. Spain, once seen as a rail backwater, launched its AVE network in 1992. The first line from Madrid to Seville started at 250 kilometers per hour. Over the next 30 years, Spain built nearly 4,000 kilometers of dedicated high-speed track, linking cities across the country at 300 kilometers per hour. Each of these systems proved that with public investment and purpose-built corridors, trains could reliably outpace cars and planes for trips of a few hundred kilometers. So while Japan, France, and Spain were racing ahead, what happened in Canada? The train leaves Toronto's Union Station at dawn, bound for Montreal. The distance between the two cities, about 540 kilometers, should be a perfect fit for fast, modern rail. But the reality is humbling. According to Via Rail's current schedule, the fastest trip takes 5 hours and 18 minutes. That works out to an average speed just under 100 kilometers per hour. Not only does this lag behind the 260 kilometers per hour that French trains reached in 1981, it actually falls short of Canada's own past. In the mid-1970s, Canadian National Supercontinental and other express services covered the same route in about 4 hours and 30 minutes. The trains were slower than today's European high-speed marvels, but they still managed an average of 120 kilometers per hour, a full hour faster than today's best Via Rail time. The numbers don't flatter. Japan's bullet train could have made the Toronto to Montreal run in just over 2 hours, even in its earliest days. France's TGV would have done it in about the same. Meanwhile, Canada's busiest passenger corridor plods along at a pace that hasn't improved in half a century. The schedule reveals a deeper story. A country that once dreamed of modern rail now finds its flagship route running slower than it did a generation ago. The question isn't just why Canada never caught up with Europe or Japan, but how it managed to fall behind its own past. Something inside the system has held it back. What happened to Canada's rail ambitions? In 1977, Canada launched Via Rail as its new national passenger carrier. But from the very beginning, the company faced a problem built into its DNA. Via Rail did not receive own tracks. Instead, it was forced to run trains on lines owned and controlled by the country's two freight giants, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific. The arrangement was formalized in a passenger service agreement that spelled out exactly where Via stood in the pecking order. Clause 5B of the agreement, still in force today, states that freight trains have dispatching priority. If a freight train and a passenger train are both scheduled to use the same stretch of track, the freight train always goes first. If a freight train is delayed, the passenger train must wait. The logic was simple. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific made their money moving goods, and their entire network was built for freight. The impact of this legal structure is felt every day. Dispatchers working for Canadian National or Canadian Pacific decide which trains move and when. When a freight train is running late, Via Rail's passenger service is pushed onto a siding or slowed down. The Canada Transportation Agency has repeatedly upheld this arrangement, citing the original contract and the Canada Transportation Act. Even today, Via Rail's access is only a lease. The freight companies can demand changes to schedules, impose delays, or reroute passenger trains as they see fit. In 2025, Via Rail tried to run a non-stop express between Toronto and Montreal, but the experiment was suspended after CN exercised its right to prioritize freight. On the busiest corridor in the country, 115 freight trains run daily between Montreal and Toronto, compared to about 20 passenger trips. The result is a built-in ceiling on speed and reliability. No matter how modern the trains, as long as they share tracks with freight, Canadian passenger rail will always be at the mercy of someone else's schedule. This foundational decision set the stage for decades of slowdowns and missed opportunities. On November 22, 1981, Canada's federal cabinet made a decision that would echo through every passenger train timetable for decades. Transport Minister Jean-Luc Pépin and Finance Minister Alan McKeon announced a 20% cut to Via Rail's operating subsidy. The numbers were blunt. 18 routes vanished overnight, including the express service linking Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. The savings, about $200 million a year, came at the cost of national connectivity. While France funneled public money into the TGV's dedicated high-speed tracks, Canada's approach defined passenger rail as an expense to be trimmed, not an investment to be built. The consequences went beyond immediate service cuts. With no capital allocated for new track, Via Rail remained locked on freight-owned lines, its fate tied to the priorities of CN and CP. The 1981 budget was not a one-time event. Over the next 4 decades, successive governments ordered study after study into the potential of high-speed rail. In 1995, a federal report found that a 300 km/h corridor between Toronto and Montreal would deliver a benefit-cost ratio of 1.3, solidly positive. Nearly 30 years later, a 2023 Transport Canada analysis put the ratio even higher, at 1.6 to 1.8 depending on the scenario. Each study concluded that high-speed rail was not only feasible, but economically sound. Yet each time the reports landed on shelves. No government committed the money, and no new right-of-way was acquired. The pattern is clear. While other countries built, Canada commissioned another round of research. The result is a corridor where evidence of viability has accumulated, but political will has not. The missed opportunity is measured not just in lost speed, but in decades of deliberate underinvestment, even as the case for change kept getting stronger. Land along the Toronto to Montreal corridor once stretched open and cheap. Now decades of urban and suburban growth have turned it into some of the most expensive real estate in the country. Each year that Canada postponed building a dedicated high-speed line, the price of assembling a right-of-way crept higher. Recent estimates peg the cost of acquiring land alone at $10 to $20 billion before a single rail is laid. Municipal expansion, rising property values, and endless rounds of study have turned inaction into a financial wall. What was once a manageable hurdle has become a massive barrier, locking out the possibility of catching up to Europe's rail revolution. Every morning, dispatchers along the Toronto to Montreal corridor juggle a lineup that tips heavily toward freight. On average, 115 freight trains claim their paths each day, dwarfing the handful of passenger runs. The legal clause giving freight absolute priority is no abstraction. It plays out in real time. In 2025, Via Rail attempted a non-stop express pilot between the two cities. The service was pulled after just a few weeks when CN invoked its right to prioritize freight, forcing the express off the schedule. For passengers, the result isn't just a slower trip. It's the constant risk of delay, rerouting, or outright cancellation, all because the tracks are built for cargo, not people. On Canada's busiest corridor, the flow of freight determines whether a passenger train can even depart on time. In 2021, Ottawa unveiled the High-Frequency Rail Plan, promising a dedicated passenger corridor from Toronto to Quebec City. The goal was a 4-hour Toronto to Montreal trip, still an hour slower than the fastest runs of the 1970s. High-frequency rail officers speak of a new era, but no construction contracts have been signed and full funding remains uncertain. The project hovers between hope and hesitation. It is a partial answer that leaves the question of true high-speed rail unresolved. Canada remains the only G7 country without a single kilometre of true high-speed rail, despite decades of studies proving it is possible. Inertia and political will, not geography, set the limits. The tracks we build or don't still decide how connected, competitive, and ambitious we choose to be. What would you choose?